Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, and a special welcome to those who have travelled today to be part of our Biennial Bruce Wilson Memorial Heritage Lecture. Also, a warm welcome to those who have taken advantage of our modern technology and will be joining us on Zoom or live streaming. My name's George Ferguson. I'm a member of the Greater Shepparton Heritage Advisory Committee, and I'm your MC for this afternoon for this impressive lecture we're looking forward to from Ms Christine Johnston. A lot of work has gone into planning the ceremony, and we hope we make sure we're providing a safe environment for everyone. By now you should all be familiar with the COVID sanitation requirements. Everyone will have had hand sanitised and either QR coded or signed on entry. Please sanitise your hands before and after taking food. Thank you. Remember, face masks are mandatory inside and out, except for genuine exemptions. The toilets are reached through the foyer on the left as you came in, and in case of an emergency, which is highly unlikely, could you just access the gardens via the exit sign over there, please. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our Mayor, Councillor Kim O'Keefe, who's with us today, and welcome you, Kim. Also, I'd like to welcome Councillor Sam Spinks and Councillor Jeff Dobson. Welcome to those councillors. I'd also like to acknowledge apologies from the Honourable Wendy Lovell MP, Steph Ryan MP, and Councillor Shane Sarley. The Heritage Advisory Committee members present also are Marge Earle, who is our chairperson, Jeff Maynard, who's the deputy chair, Anne Tyson is the secretary, Kay Ball, Barry Campbell, Janet Batten, Christine McKenzie, Mary Code, John Dayton, Deborah Bower, who are all members of the Heritage Advisory Committee. Thank you so much for everyone coming, and now my great pleasure to invite the Mayor, Councillor Kim, to come forward and open our proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've just zoomed into my little scooter and I'm getting around really well and I'm not missing out on anything, so it's really important. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, George, for the warm welcome. I would like to begin by we, Greater Shepparton City Council, acknowledge the Yorta Yorta peoples of the land, this beautiful land where we meet today, which now comprises Greater Shepparton. We pay our respect to their tribal elders, we celebrate their continuing culture, and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. I would also like to extend this welcome to any other First Nations people who are here with us today. I would also like to acknowledge my fellow councillors, Councillor Dobson and Councillor Spinks. Thank you so much for coming along today. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Bruce Wilson Memorial Heritage Lecture. I would also like to offer a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Chris Johnston, who will be officially introduced by Anne Tyson, the Secretary of the Greater Shepparton Heritage Advisory Committee. We thank you for taking the time to speak to us today, Chris. Your lecture on navigating heritage, past, present, future, will be of interest to many, I'm sure. We are extremely pleased that the Heritage Lecture could go ahead today. We are also delighted that people can watch the lecture online from the comfort of their homes via our interactive live stream. Greater Shepparton has a rich cultural heritage and there are many places of cultural significance within our region. These factors are what truly make Greater Shepparton unique. These include the Aboriginal history of our region, our agriculture and industrial history, and aspects of our migrant history, including our history of multiculturalism and our unique collection of intimate and prisoner of war camps. This is our cultural heritage. It embodies our history and is very much part of our story. These stories remind us of what is important to our community and what we have all inherited. Council plays an important role in identifying and conserving places of significance across our municipality. The Cultural Heritage Awards held in April this year is one way we can do this, along with other and our annual Heritage Conservation Grants. Greater Shepparton is one of the minority of progressive councils in Victoria offering these grants to owners of properties within the Heritage Overlay. This money can be used for critical conservation works to preserve buildings and structures well into the future. Our work was recently recognised by the Heritage Council of Victoria. They shone a light on the progressive work that has taken place in Greater Shepparton over the past decade in the identification, conservation and celebration of the region's cultural heritage. This work would not have occurred without the dedication of the members of the Heritage Advisory Committee and through events like this one today. I would like to thank you all for attending today's Bruce Wilson Memorial Heritage Lecture. In particular, I would like to thank the Greater Shepparton Heritage Advisory Committee, which has worked extremely hard to coordinate this event during the challenging times of COVID. I know you all will enjoy listening to today's lecture and take something valuable away from the session. Unfortunately, I cannot stay for today's session, but I will certainly be Zooming in tonight from my lounge room with my leg up. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, so much for opening our proceedings. I'd like now to call on Anne Tyson, our Heritage Secretary, who will come and introduce our guest speaker. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, George. It's my great pleasure to actually introduce Chris. I'd hoped she'd be up on the screen, but is she? It's great to see you, Chris, after all this communication. Fantastic. Chris, of course, is one of Australia's leading experts on heritage, and we're privileged to have her take off the mask. Chris was first contacted about this lecture in November 2019, and she's stuck with us all this time. I think that's a wonderful thing, Chris, so thank you very much. You've earned our gratitude for that. Chris has got a little link with Shepparton, a pretty tenuous little link, actually. Her father ran the Shepparton Steam Laundry in what's now Dobson's real estate building in the 1940s. I think this was before Chris was born, so I don't think she knows the building. She'd hoped to see the building, but of course she's going to have to see it post-COVID now, actually. Chris is actually one of the stars of the heritage world in Australia, at the leading edge of heritage discussion and practice. Her contribution has been extensive, over around 40 years, wide-ranging and influential. I can only hint at some of what she's done. After she graduated, Chris did work for the Dandenong Rangers Authority, the National Trust, the Victorian Government, and taught at RMIT. Then, in the mid-1980s, she set up her own heritage consultancy, Context, to carry out heritage studies, conservation management plans, heritage assessments, etc. Context grew and went on to become the gold standard of heritage consultancies. It built a national reputation and was engaged by state and federal governments for very important work. For example, Chris did the heritage strategy for our state, for the state of Victoria. She also did the management plans for Port Arthur in Tasmania, the penal section of Norfolk Island also. To put it crudely, Context got the big jobs. If you saw a report or a project by Chris and Context, you knew simply that it was first rate. Chris's work, however, has been wide-ranging. It included heritage studies for councils, Sale, Stonington, East Gippsland, etc., management plans for important places like Burley Griffin in Canberra, Lake Bort in Victoria, but very important, Anzac Parade in Canberra. Also work on the Aboriginal heritage of the Australian Alps, for example, on the Great Barrier Reef and Ballarat's historic landscape, just to name a few. But Chris has also been a leading thinker and writer about heritage and how heritage should be done, how heritage should be managed. She's combined practical and theoretical and led the discourse in many areas. One of her areas of greatest interest and influence has been social value. When heritage laws first came in Victoria, 1974, I think, really it was a lot of architects actually looking at heritage, and so history of architecture were the two things that were really concentrated on. Buildings like Como, Durrangile, Captain Mill's cottage down in 1840s cottage down in Port Fairy. But other types of heritage significance, of other heritage values, was slowly recognised. Technical values, rarity, aesthetic values, and social value. Social value, you might have seen John Lewis's really excellent article in the Shep News on Friday. Social value is the value communities and groups put on places that they are highly attached to. Shep Post Office, for example, the MCG, under the clocks at Flinders Street. It was Chris's groundbreaking work that led social value to become a prominent way of assessing heritage, This was her work, a huge paper in 1992, What is Social Value? And it's still a standard reference. Chris was also, though, at the forefront of producing methodologies, ways of assessing aesthetic value. That's, of course, probably the most subjective and difficult value to assess. She set wonderful examples in her work on the aesthetic values of Broken Hill, all those strange mining landscapes, the Tarkine in Tasmania, and the Great Barrier Reef. Incidentally, these are examples of Chris working not with just cultural heritage, heritage created by humans, but also working with natural heritage and bringing the two together in new ways. Chris also made major contributions in areas of heritage most of us know little about. Intangible cultural heritage, for example. That's the heritage we don't think of as heritage. Customs, traditions, cooking practices, crafts, techniques, etc. Chris is a member of the International Committee on Cultural Heritage. That's the Committee of ICOMOS, which is an international committee on, if I get the name right, on the International Committee on Monuments and Sites. And she co-chairs in Australia ICOMOS's Australian Intangible Cultural Heritage Committee. Another aspect of heritage, remote from most of us, but which Chris has been at the forefront of, is cultural landscapes. Landscapes resulting from the interaction of human beings and nature. You might say that all landscapes now are cultural landscapes. We've touched the earth, just about all the surface of the earth. But some are considered worth keeping. For example, the Lakes District in England, Castlemaine gold diggings, etc. Much more difficult, of course, than preserving buildings, preserving cultural landscapes. Chris has shown how the groundwork of assessment and management can be done with her work on Uluru and the cultural landscape of East Gippsland, for example. Chris has worked across Australia helping many communities document and advocate for the places they value. She runs community groups and workshops, and many of her recent projects involve Aboriginal heritage, to wit. One of her most recent and notable accomplishments has been managing the huge team that actually put together all the documentation for Budge Bin, that wonderful eel trap site. I called it eel trap and Chris corrected me in an email. An aquaculture system down in the Western Districts where the Gunda Chamara people trapped eels by building weirs, etc. Chris basically got that on the World Heritage List. And I think to her great joy and to us, it's fantastic for Australia. She worked with the Gunda Chamara really from 1990 on that site, and I think she probably got it onto the national list before she got it onto the world list. Chris was also involved in revising the Borough Charter. That's the document that sets out all the principles and practice to be followed in conservation in Australia. She was on committees that revised it in 1999 and 2013, and she wrote the practice notes, how to put it in operation, in 2013. It contains very simple, sensible principles. For example, change as much as necessary, but as little as possible when you're doing conservation. The Borough Charter is respected throughout the world. Over many years, Chris has run training courses for local government planners, taught at La Trobe Uni, and developed heritage-related curriculum materials for Deakin Uni. She's also now an honorary research associate at La Trobe University. We're privileged, Chris, to have you give this lecture. Thanks for sticking with us, and we look forward to what you've got to say.
Thank you, Anne. Chris, could I just interrupt, please? For our cultural heritage, I'd like to invite a member of the Yorta Yorta, Auntie Faye Lynham, to come forward and pronounce the welcome to the country, please.
I'm so sorry for being late, Chris. But looking around at everybody, it always starts on time, because in our age. But wow, you're a hard act to follow, my lady. You're such a busy woman. And yeah, I'd like to pay respect to the traditional owners of the land, the Yorta Yorta nations, elders past and present, and to that wonderful lady up there. And I just hope that we have a great meeting, and I'll be back later on at 6 o'clock, I think. All right, have a great meeting, and thank you very much.
Yes, over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What wonderful words. I really appreciate. Just get my screen on share. working. I think it might be. Thank you very much. That was an extraordinary and wonderfully warm welcome from Auntie Faye Lynham, from Mayor Kim O'Keefe, and from Anne Tyson. I feel like, how could I have possibly done all of those things in such a short lifetime? I think you've, yeah, thank you. It was very lovely. I also offer my heartfelt respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, for their care for country over millennia. I'm speaking to you today from Dja Dja Wurrung country in central Victoria, and I'm delighted to be here. I know it's only virtually, but it's still fantastic to be here. My theme for the Bruce Wilson Memorial Lecture is Navigating Heritage. Where have we been, where are we now, and where are we headed? If heritage is somewhat like a sea journey, we might think about setting our course by the stars. We might think about the dangers of rough seas, reefs and shoals, the joys of seeing whales and that first sight of land. As we journey, we rely on our preparation and skills. And if we find ourselves off course, we need to review and reset. And while our heritage journey is going pretty well, I think we might benefit from adjusting our course as we look to the future. Sorry, just working out how to change my slides at the same time as talking. Heritage arises from our values. We each have a personal heritage and share what is important with others, with family, cultural groups, our friends, our neighbours. Heritage is not one simple thing, and it's not something that everyone agrees on. In my talk, I'd like to explore why we might start using an awkward plural. Heritage, plural, heritages, hard to say, but to encompass that diversity that's inherent in our peoples, our lands, in our plural heritages. So key questions guiding my thinking today. What are those heritages? What values do we attribute to them? And how do we navigate difference? So what are our heritages? Well, as I say, it sounds very simple, and in many ways it is. Heritage is about us. It's about our memories, our stories, our achievements, and our failures. It's about what we did and didn't do, and about how these are reflected in the world, in what I will call places. Let me start with a story of my own that Anne has kindly rehearsed for me. 36, my dad and his first wife, Monty, married in Melbourne and moved straight to Shepparton to run the Shepparton Steam Laundry. Sure, but I don't actually know that that's my dad in the foreground loading that machine. I might be imagining it, but it looks a bit like him. Just one story about running a laundry, or perhaps it's just the one I remember. Dad said that when the laundry closed for the weekend, staff would just hot tubs for a soak. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Is it a true story? And what were the hot tubs? Doesn't look like the machine he's loading there. I don't know if it's true or not, but invited to give this lecture, you can guess what was on the top of my list to find out about. Of course, the laundry. So doing a bit more research. It's my connection here. In my example, it's a family story that connects me to the place, to Shepparton as a whole, but to this specific place, see it. It creates my curiosity and my desire to find out more. That gives me a sense of connection. Heritage creates connections. What do I mean by place? I'm going to use that term many times. I mean buildings of all kinds, streets, precincts, memorials, ruins, mine sites, gardens, broad landscapes, patches of bush. I think you get the idea. Places are full of meaning. They're resonant of the past, our own or someone else's, and they connect us to that past, like the Shepparton Laundry connects me. The past kind of connects us to the present. It works in both directions. Places remind us of stories, bring back memories. Our relationships are entwined with place. Public places in particular are so important for our social relationships. Places both produce social relationships and are the product of them. And a new space that we create in our town or our local area creates new ways of relating to it. And hasn't the COVID pandemic and all the restrictions on where we can be and with whom highlighted that so strongly for us? The importance of and being in place and being there with other people when we can. For me, I think the power of place is because we're experiencing them. We can see and touch them, smell them, walk into them, walk through them. This is a part of our everyday lived experience, and they're powerful because of that. They're, in a way, they're ordinary and yet extraordinary. They're really part of our lives. They're symbols and metaphors as well. I think they literally ground us. We often speak too about places having a spirit, a character. Perhaps we might call it a sense of place or the spirit of place. It's an elusive quality, but I think it's something we've all felt. And the destruction of a place or its loss in other ways, in a fire, or it's just it falling apart with time. These things can cause us very deep grief as well. And tangible cultural heritage. And so I've got a slide on that as well with an example which may suit some people in the room or some not. But along the place, we mustn't forget intangible heritage. So traditional and customary practices, cultural responsibilities, rituals, ceremonies, oral traditions, expressions, performances, language, knowledge, skills, craft skills. It's a long list that comes from the UNESCO 2003 Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. And in this image, you can see quite a lot of ritual going on, very famous football ritual we have in Victoria. So you can see people, dressed in particular ways. Their faces are done in particular ways. Their banners and pom-poms, they're all part of the football ritual, and they're really expressing it very strongly. And some of those things that they're using are, of course, objects, the pom-poms, the flags, but other objects, documents, archives, they're tangible, and they're also part of our heritage. So let's think broadly when we think about heritage, not too narrowly. And I'll come back later to talking about the sort of approach that we might think about for integrating all these different elements together. So for a moment, back to Shepparton Laundry. When we define heritage or we think about heritage, we use a set of terms to describe the different values that are embedded. Now, I'm going to share this list of terms from the Borough Charter, but there are many different ways of describing the different values. So aesthetic, the look of a place, its beauty, and Broken Hill, the aesthetic values of Broken Hill are to do with its dramatic mining landscape, for example. Historic, a very important value, and really one that encompasses architectural history, as aesthetic does aspects of architectural design. Scientific value or technical value. When we're thinking about places, historic places, that's usually something about the research value of the place. Perhaps it's archaeological research value, for example. Social significance, and I'll come and talk about that a little bit later, but that's about our association and connection to place, our contemporary connection, and spiritual value. So, the steam laundry. Looking at those two images, the steam laundry from, I think, about 1940 at the top and today, this is a very unassuming place. Its architectural or design qualities are very minimal. It's utilitarian and obviously adaptable to new uses. It's been adapted probably many times. Stories for me, and probably for the many people who've worked in this building over the many decades. You know, it's a long time now that this building has been part of your community. So each place may have different values, different people. I like to say heritage is plural. Different values. Some people would say it's architecture, even though it's very plain, utilitarian, it's still of its time. Others will see the stories in the place and find connections through family or long association as a worker. And each of those different ways of seeing the place, different ideas about whether the place is heritage or not, and what aspects should be recognised and protected, proposed, or is it not heritage? These are all really important questions to talk about. So through our ways of seeing the world, our cultural, social, and personal lenses, we create these multiple heritages. So what are your special places? The ones that are important to you, your family, to the groups that you're part of, to your local community? Maybe that's something to muse on as we continue on our journey. I want to now move to, so where exactly are we on our heritage journey? Heritage, as we currently practice it, really started in the post-war years. But there are antecedents in the first part of the 20th century, Royal Historical Societies, the National Parks Movement, field naturalists, and more. And in the 19th century too. But it was really after the Second World War that Australians started to develop a widespread consciousness of the need to conserve cultural heritage. At that time of post-war development, there was really a significant risk on the chance to record and look after our history, our heritage. In 1956, the National Trust formed in Victoria. I have to say New South Wales beat us by many years. They formed the National Trust in 1945. But the Trust, a voluntary community-based organisation, was really active, starting classifying significant buildings and making the very first heritage registers. Saving Coma slide was an early and really important campaign. Back then, heritage was about big stories, grand houses, fine architecture, settler stories of achievement, things we could be proud of. The community was leading the push for heritage protection. I might add too that one of the very first places to be mentioned in the Victorian, this is in around 1912 from memory, was the Mount William axe site. So a really significant Aboriginal place was the first mentioned as and needing protection in the Victorian Parliament. Thankfully, over the years, that has actually happened, but it didn't as a result of that very first mention. So into the 70s and 80s, this time saw the government response to community concerns. So I see it as there was the community started heritage and started the push for heritage, and government responded, and that's a really positive thing. There was a massive amount of legislation in the 70s in particular, including, for example, the 1972 Archaeological and Aboriginal Relics Preservation Act. It's a bit of a mouthful. Victoria at that time was the last mainland state to actually legislate for the protection of Aboriginal sites and artefacts, but it was very relics focused rather than people oriented. There was the 1972 Town and Country Planning Act that was widened to protect areas as well as objects of special significance. And as Anne mentioned, the 1974 Historic Buildings Act, and we were the first state to do so, but it was only buildings. 1973, that's when you lost the grand Shepparton post office. In the 1970s, we saw the creation of the Australian Heritage Commission, a really important national organisation, innovative, strategic, and it conceptualised heritage somewhat differently. Under one piece of legislation, it brought together natural environment, Aboriginal heritage, and historic or built heritage under one register, one piece of legislation. And over a few decades, 13,000 places were listed in the register of the National Estate. I think reflecting a real broadening and popularization of the notion of heritage and still shaping ways of thinking about heritage and heritage values today, but not one that Victoria has really followed. The 1970s as well, heritage studies started in inner city Melbourne, Drummond Street, South Melbourne, Fitzroy, and so on, and in a number of historic towns. So the 70s were a really very active time for getting some of the current frameworks of heritage in place. In Victoria, we didn't follow that Heritage Commission model. Our legislation remains separate as it does today. And as a result, we define natural, Aboriginal and historic places separately. We apply different heritage criteria. We use different mechanisms to protect them, state level and in the planning scheme. So we kind of slice and dice our environment into bits. And that's a problem in my that I think we should be looking to change in the future. Now, one of the things that we didn't see happen until the 90s and the 2000s was consideration of people's attachment to place, social value. So we gained this amazing jigsaw puzzle of legislation, a lot of government organisations very involved in heritage, protecting heritage, making registers, but social value was left out. I might describe this time as the professionals taking over. So government and government organisations with professional heritage staff for the first time were really leading. But the social value missing piece is really about communities. So what is social value? As Anne mentioned, I wrote a paper with that title many years ago now, and to my surprise, it is still used. The formal definition of social value is strong or special association, underlined, with a particular community cultural group for social, cultural, or spiritual reasons. The key things about it are, first, it's contemporary. So we're talking about a community or a cultural group that exists today and feels that strong or special attachment today. It's an enduring attachment, deeply felt, and may even be expressed as a sense of ownership. Secondly, the community or cultural group can be large or very, very small. But the main thing is that people outside that group would say, yeah, we recognise that that's a kind of a group of people that share an interest, an experience, an ethnicity, a culture, etc. So it's probably not the friends that I had Christmas dinner with every Christmas for the last 10 years. That's probably not a cultural group, but it could be the men who did national service training together at Ingleburn Army Camp in the 1960s and who, because of their age at the time and the kind of experience, built a relationship with each other and a relationship with the place that has remained strong. So cultural groups and communities are people that share that sort of common interest or common experience. And I read out the criterion before, they need to be particular. And that doesn't describe their habits in any way. It really just says we need to be able to say who they are. We need to be able to point to who is connected to that place, as I just did with the Ingleburn Army Camp example. Themes that have emerged in social value will be interesting to you. Places important to a community as a landmark, marker or signature is one example. So places used symbolically to represent a locality or a community. Shepparton Post Office was still there. That might be one for you. I'm sure there are many others. But the examples could include silos in some wheat belt towns, the tall chimneys of the brickworks in Brunswick. I'm an ex-Brunswick person, so that's a favourite of mine. The tall, huge red gum in Guildford, just down the road from me. The Loddon River that flows through and floods through my local town, Newstead. So places that really are symbols of our area where we live. A second example, places that are a reference point in our identity or sense of ourselves would be the Cockatoo Kindergarten, which was a refuge during the Ash Wednesday fires, associated with an event that had a really profound effect on that community and listed on the state register for that reason. Thirdly, places where there's strong or special community attachment from long use or association. Shepparton Post Office would be an excellent example there. And there are many examples in the Shepparton Heritage Study. The Italian Aserio, with its long-standing relationship with the Italian community, a place of remembrance and commemoration. There are many examples in your study, and you should be very proud of those. As concepts of social value began to be worked out through practice, really, so did the methods used to engage with communities about their values. One example was the Community Heritage Workshop, where local people came together through a carefully constructed process and identified the places important to them. So if you're in one of my workshops today, I'd be asking each of you to write down the places important to you. Probably say, don't worry about the grand or the big, the hidden, the everyday, the places in your heart. So exploring social value did some terrific things in the heritage field. It really, again, heritage processes to community-held values. So experts and communities together working out what is heritage rather than it being led by one or the other. Community heritage workshops became a part of standard local heritage studies in Victoria and the standard brief. And then when we reviewed the Borough Charter in the 1990s, it emerged with a much broader view of place communities in understanding our heritages. So where are we now? That's a bit of a look back. Where are we right now? It's nearly 50 years. 50 years heritage journey, if you like, since the first Victorian heritage legislation and the first heritage studies. 20 years since Shepparton's first heritage study. How are we going? Well, I'd describe it as a bit of business as usual. We've continued with what we've become good at, which is terrific. So we've done a few new things in the last 20 years. We've got a new a new national heritage list that was launched in 2003. Still only includes 120 places. And there haven't been recent additions. There have been revisions to the Heritage Act, but probably it's still skewed towards architecture and buildings. Thankfully, we've had a new Aboriginal Heritage Act in 2006, still pretty archaeological in its focus, and according to a recent report by the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council, the Act is overseeing the destruction of Aboriginal heritage where development is occurring rather than its conservation. So there's some sort of, not really good. But let me turn to what we are really good at, because at the local government level, I think is where some really fantastic things are happening. Now, the Mayor referred to a report by the Heritage Council of Victoria that really patted local government on the back, and especially the City of Greater Shepparton. So local government's doing well on historic heritage. Doing heritage studies, 96% of Victorian councils have completed both stage 1 and 2 of a heritage study, as has your council. 58% of Victoria's councils have then translated all their heritage studies into heritage overlays. That's fantastic. And I know Shepparton is well on that path too. Heritage Council of Victoria concluded the heritage overlay is really effective at protecting places from demolition, although willful neglect is still a significant issue for some councils. And most councils, more than half, have a heritage strategy like you do there. And that's really effective, taking a strategic approach, thinking about the elements that are needed in your local area. And moreover, being proactive in supporting property owners, local. That's really vital. As the Mayor said, Greater Shepparton was commended in that report, and that is really, really fantastic. It needs strengthening. The heritage overlays protect a lot of places, but the steps from heritage study to heritage overlay can be difficult, time-consuming, and they can be expensive. Protection available in the heritage overlay, great, but limited. So it can't address the complexity of natural, historic and Indigenous heritage in an integrated way. It does it in some separated ways. The overlay is great in protecting the heritage values of bricks and mortar of the place. Its architecture, design, some aspect of its history, it can protect its architecture and design and aspects of its history, but it's not so good at protecting values that aren't directly expressed in the fabric. For example, a social value of a place, like a post office, linked to its role as an informal community meeting place. Could the heritage overlay require continuing community access? Went into private ownership, for example? Unfortunately, it can't. Other tricky things, gaps, geographic gaps in some studies, gaps in the type of places we've considered, for example, trees and gardens, post-war residential, historic landscapes, cultural landscapes, and maybe even in the themes that are being considered. Still, as I said before, an emphasis on architectural and historic values. And I'd have to say that social value remains really underrepresented and under-addressed. That might be true of community values generally. Gaps in what we identify mean gaps in protection. Might reinforce a narrower community perception of our heritages. That's the plural. So, looking to the future, where might we look for inspiration and new directions? I decided I'd go and look internationally. I've covered what I think we're doing really well here. So what's happening? What are the conversations internationally? 3 things that struck me. The first one is the idea about heritage as an indivisible whole. Rather than separating nature and culture, tangible and intangible, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, how about we move to recognising, understanding and managing heritage as an indivisible whole? Secondly, people-centred approaches. working with and empowering communities to care for their heritage, asking them what they value, bringing them central place of the conversation. And then thirdly, recognising the role of culture through cultural heritage and creativity as an enabler of sustainable development. And this connects to the International Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations has adopted. Of course, climate change is a part of that conversation. So look at these things where too, I've been really musing that, what might we do here at the local level? This diagram, I'll explain it in a moment. Places tell us about our stories. And by stories, I mean what we tell ourselves about us, who we are, where we come from, in other words, our history, our relationships today, our values, our directions. Our heritage studies are based on assumptions about what stories to tell, whose stories to include, the values we attribute to those stories, places we choose to represent those stories. One way to think about heritage a little differently is to start with stories. To imagine storylines crisscrossing the landscape and work of stories where each story links to many places and many peoples. I'm suggesting that we start with the story and see where it leads and not stop at local government boundaries. How radical. The image on the slide is by elder and artist David. It's a drawing that reflects Indigenous trade routes and storylines, songlines, linking Aboriginal nations across Australia. He's an artist, so it's a sort of symbolic drawing. He shows Australia like a living creature. His lines of connection reach out into the surrounding oceans, and he talks about Australia having a head and lungs and feet and middle and a navel, that big dot right in our tummy as Australians. So instead of choosing just one place to represent a story, we could choose multiple places. We could add to that the traditions, knowledge, and cultural practices that are also an important part of the story. There might be objects, documents, and archives as well. And in doing so, we would start to see interesting links between stories and possibly, I'm not sure, but we might even start to see the whole landscape as a web of stories. So why take this approach? Well, I think it could be a way to make the invisible visible, to bring to the surface stories, peoples, and aspects of history and show how they interconnect. It's also a great way to invite different communities and cultural groups to map their storylines across the landscape too. And in that way, we're able to start exploring social value. I'd like to just give a couple of quick examples of thinking about places that I know to perhaps illustrate some of the kind of connections or storylines that those places might be telling us about. So I'm going to start with Norfolk Island. Kingston and Arthur's Vale Historic Site on Norfolk Island is one of 11 places that together make up the Australian Convict Sites, a World Heritage serial listing representing the global phenomenon, the forced migration of convicts to penal colonies in the 18th and 19th century. Norfolk Island has experienced 4 waves of settlement: Polynesian, 2 convict settlement waves, and Pitcairn. The present day community is derived from the resettlement of Pitcairn Islanders there in 1856, a consequence of the mutiny on the Bounty. And today, around a third of the 1,750 residents have Pitcairn ancestry, and more than 40% actually speak their own language, a Creole of 18th century English and Tahitian, Norfolk, For the Pitcairn descendants, the historic site isn't a historic site, it's a living landscape. It's not a relic. It's where the Pitcairn community landed in 1856 and celebrate annually as Bounty Day, and you can see that in the image. It's where the community lives and works. It's a centre of religious life through the church and cemetery. It's a place where cultural traditions are expressed and celebrations are held. The landscape in so many ways expresses the Pitcairn customs of sharing resources and common lands. So, for example, the historic site has chickens and cattle roaming through it because it's about animals being allowed to be free roaming on common lands. It's a sharing story. So Norfolk Island then links across the seas to Pitcairn, to Tahiti, to the mutiny on the Bounty, to the whole notion of settlement, resettlement. So on two levels, Norfolk is part of story networks. The first in the World Heritage serial listing, the global phenomena of convictism. And the second is part of this local to global story about exploration, discipline. The links reach across from Norfolk to Pitcairn. There are places there, there are family members there. It's still a really connected place across the oceans. My second example is quite a different one, and that's Parliament House, Victoria's Parliament, a place of state significance. So why is it important? Is it about lawmaking? Is it about architecture? Well, if you looked at the state register, that's what you would see. You wouldn't see anything about social significance or about protest. Now, this lovely image, which I hope you can see, is from 1985. 30,000 farmers protest at Parliament House. People from across the state with shared stories of hardship. There have been many protests on the steps of Parliament House. If we ask those who protested, their stories would be about that experience of protesting. They'd share stories about marching up Burke Street, about parliamentarians coming out and speaking to them or being locked up inside, I'm not sure. The network of stories, though, that brought them there on that day linked back to their home, their farm communities, their workplace, to locations all over Victoria, to all sorts of local communities. So the protests link multiple stories together, and it tells us a lot more about Parliament House if we do that than just focusing on lawmaking or architecture. It starts to bring in the people story. A third example is one of great relevance to you there, as well as it is to me, because I've been working with the city of Yarra on Aboriginal significance of Gertrude Street, Fitzroy, or the Fitzroy area. Aboriginal people across Victoria moved to Fitzroy and other inner Melbourne suburbs from the 1920s to get work. And some of the earliest arrivals were from Kamargunja, people who were part of the walk-off. So we've got a connection here between you there and the city, between the walk-off, the flats, and Fitzroy. It's a really important connection. It's a two-way connection. As part of a network of stories, Kamargunja and Fitzroy together tell us so much. They tell us about the courage expressed in the walk-off, in the move to Melbourne, in the formation of a strong community that, through its own grit and determination, creates changes that continue to resonate today. The first Aboriginal controlled health service was in Fitzroy. And I reckon I can't really write about Gertrude Street, Fitzroy without writing about Kamargunja or the flats, or in fact Parliament House, where Aboriginal protection legislation was created, resisted, and later disassembled. So I'm using those places as an example to perhaps suggest how we might make connections using stories rather than starting with places. And in this case, we've got a story that really reaches right across the landscape, connects many different peoples, white and Aboriginal. So what is heritage? In drawing to a close, I'd just like to say that I think what I'm suggesting is rather different from heritage places as disconnected dots on maps, which is typically how we document places now. By connecting up the dots, we can better express the fullness of the meanings that resonate through these places. And we can connect better to people's places as well. Stories about real people, real events, real feelings, real connections, places that are alive. And I sort of think that's what we mean by spirit of place. The spirit, the lives, the stories, the connections. How might we do this? Well, it's easy to suggest a big idea, but not quite know how to do it. Technology can help. Some councils are using a new mobile application called Passport, developed by University of Melbourne to explore citizen heritage and document places in new ways. And looking at your heritage strategy, I thought, gee, you could experiment with storylines on the scoping study of shared Aboriginal cultural heritage and the proposal to engage with culturally diverse groups around intangible heritage, both in your strategy. So in concluding, it's been fantastic to be here, and thank you to your community, the Heritage Advisory Committee and Council, and to acknowledge what a terrific job you're already doing in recognising and protecting heritage places. But let's remember that our heritage isn't static and it's multiple. Its heritage is plural. What we define as heritage reflects the relationships that link past to present and present to past and head us into the future. The stories of today will be the heritage of the future. So thinking about heritage as dynamic, keep exploring what we value and why. Technology can play a really valuable part, increasingly valuable part, and we can use it to our advantage, as we're doing today, in fact. And heritage studies are great ways to document heritage places and are a great basis for heritage overlays and planning, but they don't cover everything right now. So we need to keep expanding our horizons, to ask ourselves what stories are missing, whose stories are missing, and how might we bring those people and their stories into our community conversations about heritage. We need to look for new ways to keep our heritage studies alive. And I'll ask you again, what are the places that connect you to your locality, to your communities, to your cultural groups, to your stories, your past, present, and hoped for future? The answer to this question is the litmus test for heritage here and in every community. Thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you so much, Chris. A wonderful expose of what really we're all on about. It's the heritage of our whole culture. Can I ask Anne, would you like to say thank you?
I'd actually forgotten I was going to say thank you, Chris. I was so immersed in your talk. But thank you, as I said, particularly thank you for sticking by us for all that time. But that was a wonderful talk and does open our minds to think more broadly about heritage. Quite difficult, I think, but thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming along and enjoying the lecture. I do apologise for those little waves that the technology does, but I'm sure we were able to gather the context. Thank you so much, Chris. Now, for those present here, I'd just like to say congratulations to the Greater Shepparton City Council for your ongoing support of the Heritage Advisory Committee, enabling us to host these heritage lectures, Heritage Open Days, Heritage Signage Initiative, Cultural Heritage Awards and Heritage Conservation Grants Program. It's a wonderful list of things we're able to do, and this is only because of the scope and the vision of the Shepparton City Council. Thank you again for attending today, and thank you for those visiting on Zoom who have enjoyed the lecture. Thank you so much for joining in.
Questions now, George, yes?
Yes, is there any questions? We can...
I think Michael's got a roving microphone. Have you, Michael?
I do, thanks, Anne. There are no questions from those attending online, so if anyone has a question here today, feel free to ask.
Could I ask a question, please?
Carol, is it? Hi. Yes,
Yes.
go ahead.
I'm from Moira Shire, and although Moira Shire has got heritage overlay and done heritage studies, we've been trying to save our community hall, which is a public building. We've got no support from our councillors or our Shire staff, and so we've obviously put in for statewide heritage listing. Is there anything else we can do? Obviously, this hall's got great social value. We believe it's got a fair amount of state historical value. But how do we get people to turn around their opinions of heritage? We don't have a heritage advisory committee in our council. Any thoughts would be gratefully welcomed.
Oh, I'm so glad for a hard question. Look, I think it is very difficult. It is your local council that will offer you the best opportunity, really, for protecting your local hall or your local community taking sort of direct action, if I may say that in this forum. You know, I don't want to suggest that you chain yourself to your hall, but building up a really strong argument to your council, you know, whether it's petitions, letters, fundraising to look after the hall, if that's part of the issue, then those are all worthwhile things to do. It is very hard to get a local hall on the State Heritage Register unless there's really important aspects to it. But what you might get from the Heritage Victoria is a recommendation back to your council that they protect that hall. I'm not sure what the threats are to your hall. Perhaps you might want to add to that.
They've issued a demolition notice, so we haven't got much time. And yes, we've done petitions and we've been battling for the last 3 years. So we just need a change in sentiment, I think, and value. The attitude's been that heritage buildings cost money to maintain.
Look, my only other suggestion is, can the community take on the building? There's an interesting example near me, well, I guess it's a kind of heritage place, but it was a local swimming pool in Shepparton where the council wanted to close it. Swimming pools are expensive to maintain. Our Shire said we've got too many of them. Not that the community would think that there were too many. And the Shepparton community just said, we will take it on. That was still quite a fight, if you like, to be able to take it over and manage it. But they succeeded in doing that. They had a big fundraising appeal, a big public campaign, and they manage the swimming pool now with some guidance from our Shire and a much more positive attitude, I would say, today to that swimming pool because it continues. Good luck.
We need it.
Chris, you said something interesting in your paper, what is social value? Social value is probably best protected by an informed and politically active community with the support of legislation. That sums it up, doesn't it, really? Locals do have to become politically active. I don't think, coming back to this area, I feel that this area actually hasn't engaged in much fighting to protect its heritage, really. I'm used to the inner suburbs where really a lot of fighting went on over many years, many campaigns, etc. And it's quite interesting to me that I don't know how, I think there may have been campaigns over individual trees and stuff here, but I don't know how, and certainly for the Shepparton Post Office, I know that there was, obviously a great outcry. But that's just an interesting statement that you made.
Would you like me to comment on that?
A little bit, yes, thank you.
Yes, please, Chris.
I think it is interesting that we do need communities to really advocate for what they value. If you don't, who will know what is valued? So often the things in our everyday life, we don't really know, or councils don't really know what's valued until there's some threat or risk. So I think it's quite critical that we find ways of documenting places. I also have said, Anne's kind to read something I wrote so long ago, but I've also said that often we don't find out that a place is valued until someone comes along with a bulldozer and parks a bulldozer next to it, and we realise that it's actually about to be demolished. Because in our everyday life, we don't have the time, perhaps, to express our connections to every little piece of what's in our environment. So, yeah, we need to do a bit more of the work, I think.
Thanks, Chris, for your presentation. It was terrific. I'm Jeff Allamand. I manage the Shepparton Heritage Centre. What do you see, or how do you see the value of social media in the fight for heritage and the communication and about heritage locally, nationally, and internationally?
Well, I think we all would recognise today that social media is very important, even if some of us don't use it or some of us do use it. So I think it is very important. Whether it's influential is probably a key question to ask. Is a social media campaign going to influence the people that you're wanting to influence or not? For some of the work that I do, I find social media is actually quite a useful research source. So it tells me something about what people are debating, particularly if they're talking about the value of a place before it's threatened. It's easy after something's threatened, we can get very hot under the collar and be very active on social media. But what's the conversation, before the threat? So I think 2 points there. One is, who are you trying to influence? Are they listening to social media, or will they take it as credible? Or are you trying to look to demonstrate social value? And in that case, maybe social media and lots of other sources will be valuable to you.
Any other questions in the room here, please? If not, I'd like to draw our meeting to a close, and thank you so much, Chris, for your lovely illustrations in your lecture. I'm just like to invite those present here with us today, if you would like to stay for afternoon tea and enjoy some more fellowship with each other. Thank you so much for that.